Today is the 6th day of the month of Teves. We are in the middle of chapter 36 discussing the laws of how to salt meat once the meat is slaughtered to remove all of the blood. We will be going from paragraph 11 through the end of the chapter, paragraph 28. Paragraph 11. Once you have the meat fully salted, it then has to sit in that salt for an hour. Paragraph 12. Once that hour is up, you then brush off all the salt and you rinse it with water 3 times. You have to make sure that you don't put it into any sort of bowl before you rinse it, because if so, there's a concern that there will be blood that will still be coming out of the meat, and then there will be blood that's absorbed into the salt, and then when you put it into a bowl, that blood might be reabsorbed into the meat. Therefore, you have to make sure you're not putting it into any sort of bowl until it is rinsed 3 times. Paragraph 13. When salting poultry, chicken, etc., you have to make sure to totally sever the head before salting it. That's because the blood vessels in the neck have an extreme amount of blood in them, so you have to make sure they're fully severed in order that any blood in them should drain out for the salting to be able to do a proper job. Paragraph 14. If you have unsalted meat, you should make sure to not put it down in a spot which has some salt. Because you're not doing the salting of the meat now, you're just resting it there, you might not realize that it touched some salt, and therefore you're not going to rinse it, and then we had that problem that I mentioned earlier that some blood might come out, get absorbed into the salt, and then get reabsorbed into the meat. So if you have unsalted meat, you have to make sure that you're putting it down, you're storing it in a place where there's no salt around. It's appropriate to have a separate set-aside bowl or container to keep the unsalted meat in, and to not use that container for any other food items. There's always a concern there might be, since this is regularly used to store meat which has blood in it, there's a concern that there might be some blood in this container won't be cleaned properly. Even for cold items, you shouldn't put in there, because since there's regularly blood here, you might not clean it well, and it might end up on some food. The next bunch of paragraphs talk about how to salt specific parts of the animal. It gets a bit technical and detailed, so we're going to skip paragraph 15 through paragraph 19. Just tell you what they're about. It's talking about how to salt the head of an animal, how to deal with the bones, how to deal with the legs, cutting off the hooves, how do you salt the heart, how do you salt lungs, what do you have to do to make sure you get all the blood out of lungs. We're going to go to paragraph 20. Even paragraph 20 we're not going to go through fully, we'll just talk about it. So liver is much more complicated to get the blood out of. Liver has so much blood that salting doesn't work, and liver has to be roasted to get the blood out of it. So how do you do that? Paragraph 20 says you slice open the liver, and then the side that has the slices in it, you put face down in a perforated pan. You then put this pan over the fire. You add a little bit of salt in it as you put it over the fire, and then you roast it till it's fully cooked. Once it's fully cooked, you rinse it well, and again, you're supposed to rinse it 3 times. Paragraph 21, you have to make sure that the liver is actually over a fire. It's not just in a very hot oven. Nowadays, it's not so relevant, but used to be the ovens you'd have fire in the ovens, and even when the fire went out, the oven itself would contain a lot of heat. So you have to make sure that it's an over actual fire, it's not just in a heated oven. Paragraph 22, you have to make sure that you do not salt the liver before roasting it. We mentioned putting a little bit of salt in it just as you're putting it on the fire, but you shouldn't put any salt in it or any significant amount of salt in it for sure before you roast it. And also you should make sure that you're not putting any salt in it along with other meats. If it's in the same bowl as other unsalted meats, then you have a big problem, because it's going to draw a lot of blood, and that blood can get into the other meats. So you have to make sure that it's not being stored or being salted with any other meats. If you're buying whole liver in the store, then you could find liver that's been roasted already, but very often the liver is not roasted and it has to go through the roasting process to get rid of the blood. So I recommend before buying liver, check it out, investigate was this liver roasted yet or not yet, to have to worry about the blood. And if you do, then please make sure to speak to a competent Orthodox rabbi to make sure that you know how to roast it properly so that you get the blood out of the liver, and also that you don't end up trafing up your oven, making your oven tray for not kosher because the blood gets into your oven or into your other pots or utensils, etc. So you got to really know what you're doing. The next few paragraphs discuss other parts of the animal. Paragraph 23 discusses how do you salt a spleen. Paragraph 22 talks about how to salt the intestines. And paragraph 25 talks about if somebody slaughters a cow and they find a calf, and they find milk in the stomach of the calf, what's the status of that milk? Paragraph 26 discusses what to do if you find eggs inside a chicken. You slaughter a chicken, you find eggs in there. What's the status of those eggs? Do they have the status of eggs that are pareve, that aren't meat or dairy? Or are they considered part of the meat and therefore you have to treat them like meat and therefore they might require salting as well? So the answer is that they do require salting, but because they might not need salting, you can't have them touching any other meat. In addition, even though they may be fully formed eggs, and if you would have waited another 10 minutes to slaughter this chicken, it would have laid this egg. Still, this egg is considered meat and you cannot be eaten with milk. Paragraph 27. If unsalted meat sat for 3 days or 72 hours without being salted, it can no longer be salted. At that point, we assume that the meat became so absorbed, it's so just congealed, coagulated inside this meat that salting the meat won't get out that blood. The only way to get that blood out is by roasting it. And there's something unique about this is by the liver, once you roast it, you can then cook it. With this meat, if it sat 72 hours, even though you could roast it and to get out the blood and now eat it, you can't there afterwards cook it. Paragraph 28. After a chicken is slaughtered, then the way that it's processed is it's common, or it was common at least, to burn the feathers to get the feathers off. The problem is that if you put this bird too close to a fire, then the outside might cook a little bit and it might cook the blood into the meat, and now you can't get that blood out anymore. That would make the chicken not kosher. Therefore, one has to make sure that they're using some sort of fuel for this fire. If they're doing the singeing process, the burning the feathers process, they have to make sure to use some sort of fuel such as straw, which doesn't generate a lot of heat. And you also have to make sure they're using a small flame that you could work with easily to make sure that the bird is close enough to the fire to singe the feathers, but not too close to cook any of the meat. This concludes chapter 36 about salting meat. And this concludes today's episode. Have a wonderful day and see you tomorrow.